Sí, hoy va a ser bastante corto porque, bueno, no está la mayoría de hermanos, entonces no tiene sentido de que hagamos la formación larga. Pero sí es bueno que es importante que vean esto, porque parte de la tarea de esta semana tiene que ver con lo que van a ver ahora. Y pongo aquí. ¿Listo? Bueno, llegamos a nuestra novena sesión sobre el Concilio Vaticano II. Es importante que vean o que consideren que lo que estamos haciendo es dar algunos lineamientos para poderlo entender, para poderlo estudiar. No tiene sentido de que agarremos los documentos del concilio si no sabemos un poco su historia, si no sabemos cuál es su importancia, y más que su importancia, cómo se puede aplicar a nuestra vida de fe, a nuestra experiencia de fe. Nuestra formación hoy empieza con un testimonio, va a tener tres partes. Empieza con un testimonio, esta mujer es una escritora muy reconocida, a nivel internacional ha recibido muchos premios, ella nace en una familia católica, no estamos hablando, o sea, la persona que van a ver en el video con el que empezamos hoy no es una agente de pastoral, no está trabajando en la iglesia, nace en una familia católica, se separa un tiempo de la familia católica, ya van a ver por qué, de la iglesia, pero luego con el pontificado de Francisco ella se empieza a acercar. Es una mujer, una pensadora, y como van a ver en el video, parte importante de lo que ella va a decir tiene que ver con la misión que nosotros tenemos a partir del concilio. Para no adelantar qué va a decir el video, lo vamos a ver, y luego al final yo voy a retomar puntos importantes de lo que ella va a decir. Ella no va a hablar hoy de la iglesia, o sea, este video no es sobre la iglesia, pero tiene que ver todo con la iglesia. Así que vamos a poner mucha atención y luego del video pues seguimos con la formación del día de hoy. Mucha atención porque todo lo que ella va a decir tiene que ver con el concilio, aunque nunca lo menciona. En un artículo ella mencionó el concilio y vio cómo descubrió otra iglesia cuando empezó a estudiar el concilio. ¿Okay?
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed, in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I, too, am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now, this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Tyler, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Ukuloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes, the immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who are not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in the Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds? Films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce. What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I am home, I am confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a nonprofit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also of organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and a kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
¿Qué tiene que ver con el concilio esto? Ojo, toda la gente que estamos viendo aquí, todas las producciones que estamos viendo acá, vimos algo sobre la misa criolla, hemos analizado un poquito de arte, todo tiene que ver con el concilio. Esta mujer es católica, viene de una familia católica, y su reconciliación plena con la iglesia vino a raíz del pontificado de Francisco, porque ella dijo, o sea, en Francisco ya ha podido dar cuenta de que el concilio realmente tomó vuelo, tomó rostro, tomó identidad, no porque no se diera con Juan Pablo ni con Benedicto, sino que en el contexto en el que vivía, en la época en que vivía, pues no tenía muchos referentes de ellos. Entonces, ¿qué pasaría si la gente conociera la historia, la gente del común, conociera la historia de un hombre que es capaz de ofrecer su vida por un prisionero que va a ser condenado a muerte? ¿Qué pasaría si la gente conociera la historia de un hombre que deja todo y funda una comunidad dedicada a las personas con discapacidad, la comunidad del Arca? ¿Qué pasaría si la gente del común conociera una monjita que funda en todo el mundo una comunidad que se llama la Comunidad de Manuel para recuperar a personas en estado de dependencia a drogas, solo con la oración? ¿Qué pasaría si la gente del común conociera profesionales, gente con toda una vida por delante, con todo el talento por delante, y se van a Kenia o se van a Turkana en el África, en el Cuerno de África, a dar la vida? O sea, la gente del común no conoce eso. Y parte de la experiencia de esta formación que estamos haciendo aquí en la comunidad es que no solo estamos viendo el concilio, estamos viendo también cómo el concilio se puede ver, se puede tocar, se puede escuchar en la vida de seres humanos, hombres y mujeres reales. Parte importante de esta recomendación es para los que están afuera: investiguen en sus comunidades, investiguen en sus países qué iniciativas hay para que los hermanos conozcan. Cuando hicimos esta primera formación hace unos meses, la primera vez que empezamos a hacerlo fue casi 2 años atrás. Empezamos a investigar la vida de los santos, empezamos a investigar las realidades eclesiales. Tuvimos exposiciones donde mostrábamos como los principales carismas o las principales realidades eclesiales que surgieron a partir del Concilio Vaticano II. ¿Cuál era el objetivo de eso? Que pudieran ver que el concilio realmente dio sus frutos y todavía lo sigue dando. Entonces la tarea para esta semana es un documento. Hay una historia que van a tener que leer, una historia real sobre una diócesis en España que literalmente estaba muerta a nivel pastoral, y cómo la fidelidad de un obispo hizo que toda una comunidad se volcara hacia la evangelización. En el fondo, porque uno de los grandes problemas que tenemos a la hora de acercarnos al Concilio Vaticano II es pensar, primero, que son unos documentos, y segundo, que no es para nosotros, que es para los sacerdotes, que es para las religiosas, que es para los consagrados, pero como que los laicos no nos apropiamos del compromiso evangelizador que hay aquí. Entonces, esta formación de hoy tenía un poco otros componentes, no lo vamos a hacer todos porque falta la mitad de la comunidad, y para no volverlo a repetir, pero para los que están afuera y de pronto los hermanos que no han podido venir, es fundamental que en los documentos que va a subir Jesús en la página de la comunidad, vean este video. Cuando estábamos viendo esto de la única historia, el peligro de una única historia, ¿cómo lo podemos asociar al laicado que tenemos hoy?
Al laicado.
Laicado. Ojo, el laicado comprometido somos nosotros, pero hay otro laicado que no es comprometido. De hecho, más adelante, hay una formación que vamos a tener. Yo he estado trabajando en los niveles del catolicismo. Es un trabajo independiente mío, no lo he visto en ningún lado, hasta ahora, hasta donde sé, creo que es trabajo original, porque yo no lo he visto en ningún lado. O sea, he puesto 33 niveles, suena como masonería, porque la masonería tiene 33 grados, pero aquí es por la edad de Jesucristo. Entonces he puesto católicos nivel 0 a católicos nivel 33, y he hecho como una especie definición qué sería ser un católico de nivel 2, de nivel 3, de nivel 4, qué hace un católico de ese nivel, porque a la larga, inspirándome un poquito en el trabajo de Matthew Kelly, me he dado cuenta de que por lo que la gente hace uno puede decir más o menos en qué nivel está. ¿Para qué hacer algo así? Sencillamente para que uno se pueda revisar. Ya yo estoy en el nivel 12 o en el nivel 15. ¿Qué me faltaría para subir al siguiente nivel? A la larga es también una forma de que los hermanos se comprometan a mejorar su experiencia de fe y obviamente su compromiso en lo que tiene que ver con la evangelización. Vamos a darnos cuenta que, por ejemplo, un cristiano nivel 33 ya es un santo, canonizado, ¿ya? De pronto, un cristiano nivel 25 es lo que literalmente deja su país para trabajar en evangelización. El nivel 5 es un católico que ya está en un movimiento de la iglesia, pero que todavía no conoce mucho sobre la iglesia y de pronto se puede quedar en nivel 5 toda su vida. Tenemos gente en un grupo de oración 35 años, pero nunca ha abierto el catecismo ni sin culpa. Entonces, la idea con esta estratificación, por decirlo de alguna manera, o descripción del catolicismo, es una forma de revisarnos y ver cómo podemos mejorar. Muy bien, ¿qué tiene que ver esto de la del peligro de la única historia con el laicado?
Todo, porque
Fuerte. Ajá.
en las redes,
Ajá.
todo, y los católicos los tienen estigmatizados a nivel mundial, como se dice, como los hipócritas, adoradores de imágenes.
Siguen contando una única historia, que se repite, ¿ah?
Siempre.
Se repite.
Siempre nos estigmatizan con todo eso y no ven, o no ven todo lo que los católicos no ven la otra cara. Muy recientemente,
Ajá.
con la marcha que tuvo aquí en día, yo he escuchado o he leído publicidad de que la gente engañada por los católicos, curas, pedastras y de salieron a marchar sin saber qué estaban haciendo, diciendo y haciendo, y los homosexuales felices diciendo, o sea, creen que somos una masa de estúpidos, no sé qué, que no leemos, no estudiamos, no pensamos y salimos porque un sacerdote lo dijo. Nunca ni un sacerdote ni nada tuvo que ver en eso. Pero bueno, así todo lo estigmatizan y van encajando a uno dentro de los parámetros de ellos siempre, ¿no?
Dejamos que la historia de nuestra iglesia la cuenten otros, ya sea porque la escuchan o ya sea porque la asumen. Y aquí el problema es que cuando no hablas o no defiendes tu fe, pues eso es como a nivel empresarial o como a nivel institucional se habla del silencio positivo administrativo. Aquí sería el silencio negativo administrativo. ¿Qué quiere decir eso? Que simplemente no defendemos nuestra fe y la gente da por hecho de que su ataque es real o que lo que está diciendo es así. Ahora, cuando se está hablando del peligro de una única historia, ¿qué historias no se han contado sobre la iglesia? Al mundo, al hombre de hoy, del siglo XX, siglo XXI, ¿qué no le estamos contando, Hilda? ¿Qué no estamos contando como iglesia? Porque parece que nos limitamos a ir a la misa el domingo, de pronto uno que otro grupo, pertenecer a cualquier movimiento, pero ¿por qué no hay gente evangelizando en las calles? ¿Por qué si tú haces una pregunta o haces una encuesta en la mayoría de movimientos, y hablo del caso de Barranquilla, dime qué estrategias de evangelización estás haciendo, la gente no te puede responder ni siquiera con claridad qué es evangelización?
Asumen que todo lo tienen que hacer son la gente que está en la iglesia, los padres, las visitas, pero que nosotros como laicos,
eso no nos toca a nosotros.
Eso no nos toca a nosotros. Nosotros nuestro deber es ir a misa y ya.
Y ya con eso estamos haciendo suficiente. Tenemos una obligación histórica, tenemos un compromiso histórico. Como nunca antes en la historia de la iglesia, tenemos los medios para contar nuestra historia. Si hubiésemos vivido en la época del Imperio Romano hubiese sido muy difícil, sobre todo en la época de las persecuciones. Si hubiésemos vivido en la época del Medioevo, hubiese sido muy difícil. Pero estamos en el siglo XXI donde cualquiera puede agarrar una cámara y grabar un buen video y hacer algo muy creativo y transmitir un mensaje. Hemos estado viendo esta semana en las redes sociales muchísimas experiencias interesantes de católicos que están haciendo eso, transmitiendo poderosamente un mensaje. En la serie que les he pedido que vean, esta serie de Estados Unidos, que es una serie de la renovación carismática católica, lo vuelvo a repetir, es importante que veamos que hay mucho a la mano. Pero aquí hay otro problema. No solo no contamos las historias, está el otro problema de los católicos que no quieren escuchar las historias, que se quieren quedar con una sola, única versión. No, yo solo quiero la misa de domingo, yo solo quiero, yo no quiero leer, yo no quiero estudiar, yo no quiero ninguna experiencia de formación sólida. Y por eso pasa el tiempo y realmente no hay ningún compromiso de evangelización. Entonces, la tarea de esta semana va a ser este estudio, que Jesús también lo va a colgar ahí en la página, es una diócesis de España, y la idea es que este video, las personas que están a cargo en sus comunidades, pues proyecten todo esto, ¿no? El video, sobre todo este video de esta escritora, y analicen. A partir de ahí se puede hacer muchísimo trabajo. Entonces, quiero terminar volviendo a hacer una invitación muy importante. Se sabe si estamos viviendo realmente nuestra fe, si nosotros podemos analizar los rasgos de nuestro catolicismo dinámico y ver qué tan activos o inactivos están. Por ejemplo, si yo después de analizarme veo que de esos 4 rasgos yo no evangelizo, yo no aporto a la evangelización, no me formo, simplemente me he dedicado a una vida de oración, y eso, sin mayor profundidad, quiere decir que hay mucho trabajo por delante. Nosotros como Chivitas Dei tenemos la gracia de que el Señor nos ha llamado a una realidad eclesial donde nuestra gran misión es anunciar el amor de Dios. Y se anuncia, como lo hemos dicho, con un catolicismo que mueva, que conmueva y sobre todo que acerque a Dios. Entonces, debido a la asistencia hoy, pues lo dejamos hasta aquí y esperamos que luego de ver este video y suscitar la reflexión en sus comunidades, pueda realmente esto ayudarles mucho. Que tengan buena noche y esperamos, estaremos en la 10ª sesión la próxima semana.